Hey, welcome to Fi Minded. I'm Justin Peters, fellow personal finance enthusiast on the path to financial independence. Today, we are digging into the 50-30-20 rule. This is a classic personal finance guideline that I had honestly forgotten about until I stumbled upon it recently. If you need a quick refresher, this guideline suggests allocating 50% of your income to your needs, 30% to your wants, and 20% to savings. It's a solid starting point for traditional retirement. But I was curious to see how well it would work for someone chasing FI. So I decided to compare it to my own numbers. I pulled out my old spreadsheets, calculated the percentage, and what I found was pretty interesting. So in today's episode, I'm going to walk you through how closely my spending actually matched to the 50-30-20 rule, what surprised me, and suggest an adapted version of this rule that works for people on the path to financial independence. Let's get into it. Okay, before we jump into my numbers, let's dive a little bit deeper into the 50-30-20 rule. I was surprised I stumbled across the fact that this rule was actually popularized by Senator Elizabeth Warren whenever she wrote the book All Your Worth. She suggested simply dividing your budget into three different categories. The first being your needs and allocating 50% of your income towards this category of expenses, meaning housing, groceries, car and transportation, insurance, medical, your phone bill, etc. Then 30% towards your wants. These are discretionary spending items like travel, entertainment, date nights, food and drinks out with friends, gifts, shopping, etc. And then finally, 20% towards savings. Of course, this is savings for your retirement, but also building your emergency fund, planning to buy real estate, or even paying off your debt. It was pretty cut and dry whenever I was looking through my expenses, what fell into which category. Outside of a couple of things that I felt like were a little bit in the gray area. Two examples personally was my gym membership, which in today's day and age, I would definitely consider a need of mine. So I actually did put it into my needs category. And then another one was personal development. This is me spending money on conferences, books, all the things that kind of fall into learning and improving myself. And for sake or simplicity, I just put that into wants. One other important distinction in this 50-30-20 rule is that your income is considered after-tax income. This is not gross income. This is not how much money or what your salary is, but actually the net income after taxes. So your quote-quote take-home pay. And what's my general opinion on the 50-30-20 rule? Actually, I really like it. I think this is a super helpful guide for most people who plan to work 30 to 40 years and want to retire comfortably, always have enough money to cover their basic needs, and also have money to spend on fun things like travel and eating out. And if you look at the savings, the 20% savings rate, I love this. This is about 4 times more than the average personal savings rate in the US, which is 4.6% per American. But for someone pursuing financial independence, 20% is likely going to be a bit of a drag. I don't know that many people in the community that are saving 20%. More times than not, I usually hear somewhere in the 40 to 50% range, depending on people's goals, income, and lifestyle. And it's clear to see why, and we can illustrate through an example, and then I'll also share my own numbers. So let's just talk through a super simple, easy example so you can illustrate this. I am going to make a fair amount of assumptions here and not talk about a lot of the peripheral things in this example, but it's really just to illustrate why I think the 20% savings rate falls a little bit short for most people that are wanting to pursue financial independence. Let's assume their effective tax rate on the $100,000 is going to be 15%. So we'll take $100,000 minus $15,000. That's going to leave us with $85,000 in our taxable income to divide into these three buckets. So 50% of $85,000 for needs would be $42,500, and 30% going towards our wants would leave us with $25,500. So collectively, our expenses would be $68,000. And then 20% being allocated towards savings, 20% of $85,000 is $17,000. So this theoretical person making $100,000 is going to be allocating $68,000 of it towards expenses, $17,000 towards savings, and then $15,000 towards taxes. Now, let's think about this theoretical person's FIRE number. So, of course, we're going to have to assume the $68,000 in expenses, and then I'm going to actually leave off the $17,000 towards savings. If they have reached financial independence, they're probably no longer saving towards retirement. maybe even some of the other things like the emergency fund or paying off debt, we're going to assume most of that is already completed. And then we need to add in a little bit more of expenses for taxes, because whenever we start pulling out money that we save for retirement, we will get taxed. Although I just read through Sean Mullaney and Cody Garrett's book, Tax Planning to and Through Early Retirement, and I'm fairly convinced myself and many others in the FI community are going to pay next to nothing for taxes in their post-FI years, mostly due to no longer having to pay FICA taxes, things like basis recovery, or even the favorable tax treatment towards long-term capital gains. All of this added together, you can easily see an example where somebody needing $68,000 in their FI years are got to pay 0% in taxes. But let's go ahead and add a little bit of money back into this equation for taxes. I added $7,000 back to give us just the round number of $75,000. So then we're going to take that $75,000, multiply it by 25 for the FIRE number calculation, and this person is going to need $1.875 million for their FI number. Let's take a breath there. I know that has a lot of numbers here. Rather than doing this by hand, I'm going to pull open a compound interest calculator, and I'm going to take that original $17,000 being put towards savings every single year and figure out how long in that situation would it take somebody to reach their $1.875 million FI number. So with a 7% average rate of return, I calculated that it would take 32 years for someone to reach that number, which, looking at that, 32 years is amazing. Let's assume that someone in their 30s started saving towards retirement, and that means that somewhere in their 60s, they're going to be able to comfortably retire. But I know most people in the FIRE community, working 32 years is a non-starter, which gets me back to this 20% savings rate and why I think this rule is just not a great guideline for the financial independence community. Here's what I'm suggesting instead. I'm suggesting rather than a 20% savings rate, let's do a 50% savings rate. And let's take that exact same example. The person making $100,000, their after-tax income being $85,000, and instead of saving $17,000, they're going to be saving $42,500 every single year towards their financial independence number. And if I replace the $17,000 with the $42,000 in the compound interest calculator, instead of taking 32 years, it's actually got to take them 21 years. So they shave off 11 years. And 21 years is a way more realistic for most people on the path to financial independence. Most people are wanting to get this done in a decade and a half, 2 decades or so. But let's not stop there. If someone is saving 50% rather than 20%, that means that they're not spending 80% of their income. They're actually only spending 50% of their income. So out of that 85,000, if they're actually only spending 42,500 and we multiply that by 25, their FIRE number in this situation is actually 1,062,500. Or for simplicity's sake, let's just call it $1.1 million. So rather than that 1.8, 1.1. And if we put that 42,500 towards that 1.1 number, that actually brings the timeline down from 21 years to 15 years. Now, this is a timeline that I know the FIRE community is actually really excited about. So instead of the 50-30-20 rule, my adapted FI version is actually 30-20-50. So rather than 50% going towards your needs, 30% going towards your needs. Rather than 30% going towards your wants, 20% going towards your wants. And rather than a 20% savings rate, a 50% savings rate. Of course, these kind of numbers are going to drastically change your mentality, and you're going to have to make a lot of difficult choices. Many difficult choices that I know the FIRE community is comfortable making, but you're going to also have to be pretty creative. You know, going down from 50% towards your needs to 30% towards your needs is going to force you to have some creative approaches towards especially the big three, you know, housing, food, and transportation. So on the housing front, this is probably a situation where you're living with a roommate longer, or you're moving to a low cost of living area in your city, or maybe even moving from a high cost of living city entirely to a low cost of living city. For food, this is probably eating in way more than eating out. In transportation, there's probably not a situation where many people are upgrading their car every other year. This is probably finding reliable cars, treating them well, and driving them for 7, 10, 15 years. But of course, all of these can be worth it. If you're looking at 15 years of working versus 32 years of working, I mean, we have like another 17 years of our life that we have under our control versus somebody else's control. So let's jump into my numbers and see if how I stacked up against the adapted 5 version of the 50-30-20 rule and see which one I'm closer towards. Am I the traditional 50-30-20 or am I the adapted 5 version 30-20-50? So I was actually really bummed. I only had my budgets and spreadsheets from 2020 on my new computer. At some point in time, whenever I go back to my parents' house, I'll have to grab my old computer that I have. I'm pretty sure I have spreadsheets back from like 2013. It'll be really fun to run those numbers, especially early on in my career when I wasn't making a whole lot of money. I'm sure these numbers would look entirely different. But what I did was take all of my expenses from 2020 to 2025. I categorized them into the needs, the wants, and the savings. And here's what I found. Over that time, 29% of my after-tax income went towards my needs. 14% went towards my wants, and 56% went to my savings. So I'm pretty proud of myself. I think I actually lined up pretty well with my adapted 5 version of this rule. But to double click or zoom into a couple of these specific years, I'll share a few other observations or trends that I noticed. The first and the obvious is that in 2020, I took a mini retirement and my year looked messed up. And that year, my after-tax income was $19,000 and I spent $18,000 of it on my needs. So I actually ended up spending 97% of my income that year on my needs. I also spent about $3,000 on wants. That ended up being 14% of my income. You guys can see where I'm going already. That number's already over 100%. And I actually spent part of my savings. So I have a negative savings number. I spent a little bit over $2,000 from my savings account in order to take a mini retirement that year. I think my one saving grace that year, at least in terms of looking at my expenses, was the year of COVID. So a lot of my travel and entertainment that I planned ended up getting canceled, which is probably why my wants are so low. Like, it's crazy to know that I only spent $3,000 on wants that year. But I did get back to work in 2021. And pretty much since then, up until about 6 months ago, I was working in a full-time capacity, many years, both with business income and with W-2 income. And over the course of those years, the range of percentages was, for my needs, between 20% and 38%. For my wants, it was 11% to 18%. And for my savings rate, it was anywhere from 45% to 68% last year. On one hand, I'm really proud of that 68% savings rate. But this year, I've been intentionally trying to actually spend a little bit more, or at least not say no to opportunities. I think 68% is fairly aggressive. There were probably many moments where I could have spent a little bit more on convenience or fun. The other big observation here was that as my income grew, my expenses didn't grow at the same rate. So actually on my total expenses, so if I added up both my needs and my wants, excluding 2020, the difference over the last 5 years from total expenses has actually only been $7,000. So this year has been my highest year of expenses. 2021 was my lowest year of total expenses, and that difference is only $7,000. Over that same course of time, I've doubled my income. So although my life wasn't really changing too drastically, I don't feel like I was really cutting at all since my income kept growing. My savings rate was just naturally growing with it. I wasn't intentionally trying to spend more. I was just kind of going through life, still enjoying the same little things that I've joined year after year, and then just putting towards any extra money towards my savings. I know these numbers early on in my career would be drastically different. I would definitely probably be closer to the 50-30-20 rule whenever I first started working. I just wasn't making enough in order to really have a high savings rate. And I think that's totally okay. As we're finishing up this episode, I want to remind you that this is a guideline. I think this can be the adapted new version. The 30-20-50 rule can be great for anyone that is really excited about supercharging their financial independence journey right now. They feel like they're living a pretty comfortable life and they can take that on right now. But I do want to remind you that seasons of life should be considered. I would not take my 2020 year back where I took a mini retirement and I did so many fun things for an extra $10,000 or $20,000 towards my financial independence number. There also might be seasons of your life where you need to consider adjusting these numbers too. Maybe you're a soon-to-be parent, or you're leaving your corporate job to start a business, or you want to take some time off to go travel. These things should all be considered, and a guideline like this shouldn't restrict those decisions. Instead of zooming in on 1 year or even 1 month of expenses, zoom out a little bit further. And if you're winning this ratio game over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, you're going to be well on your way to financial independence. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the 50-30-20 rule? Do you think the adapted 5 version, the 30-20-50 rule, is attainable, doable for most people? And more importantly, where are you at? Dust off all your old spreadsheets or however you track your money. And I'd be curious to know, over the last 5 years, how did your ratios fall out? Are you closer to the traditional rule? Are you closer to the adapted 5 version? You can always send me an email, start a conversation with me at justin@fiminded. That's justin@fiminded.com. Or if you're on Spotify or YouTube, drop a comment so that I can read those too. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Looking forward to seeing you guys in the next one.